Thank you very much, Karen, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the organising committee for inviting me to come all the way to Kuala Lumpur, which is a magnificent city, and I'm enjoying my stay here very much indeed. I was invited to give this talk, and my first reaction was the reaction that you see on the left, and my second reaction was the reaction that you see on the right. It's such an enormous topic. How can I hope to encompass that entire topic in this 15 or 20-minute session? I do feel very much like that guy on that tricycle there. And the organising committee said to me, we know that you're into medical legal stuff, you know, is there anything that you want to talk about? And I said, well, I don't know, if you're going to invite me to KL, I'll talk about anything you like. And they said, right, euthanasia, right. I said, great, thanks, you know. So here I am. I can probably skip the introductory page. A long time ago, I got a medical degree in Scotland. I give anaesthetics for a living, and I also write stuff, and I look good in blue. In terms of conflict of interest, I have no financial conflict of interest of any kind. If anyone in the audience wishes to sponsor me large sums of money, I'll do whatever you want. I'm not a member of any pressure group. I do not wave placards. I do not write letters. I did not write a submission to the New Zealand Parliament about the end-of-life choice bill, but very pertinently, I am currently alive. And at some future point, this will no longer be the case. So when we talk about euthanasia, it naturally makes everybody feel a little bit uncomfortable. It touches on all kinds of areas that surround us in our lives. And there's a kind of Venn diagram that you can kind of draw with euthanasia in the center, and it almost overlaps some of those other areas. And so that may color our own perceptions as doctors about what we feel euthanasia is really like. As well as its kind of society image, euthanasia also touches on many aspects of academia or society. So there are many things, again, that euthanasia touches upon: religion, science, philosophy, psychology, sociology. All of those things impinge on our own concept of what euthanasia actually means. So let's go back to the dictionary, and I know that you know this. If there's any classical Greek scholars in the audience, please leave now. The first attested use of the word euthanasia in English was in 1606, and it comes from those two Greek roots, eu meaning good, and we talk about euthyroid, meaning the patient's thyroid function is normal, so we use eu all the time, and thanatos, meaning death. Have you all seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where the guy says, show me any word, and I'll tell you how it comes from the Greek? I wish he was here now giving this talk instead of me. So that's where it comes from, and I know that you know that. Every schoolgirl knows that, so it's easy to move on from there. If we start looking at codes of morality, now I do apologize for having a somewhat Western view on this, and that's because the medicine that I practice is based very much on sort of Western moral principles. We can start with a document like the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue or whatever you want to call it. No one knows exactly when it was written, but probably in around the 6th century BC. If you can speak Greek, there it is. If you can speak Hebrew, there it is. But most of us would translate that into a phrase that we would recognize as something resembling, thou shalt not kill. So for a long way back, you know, there has been a prohibition against killing, and that's been written down on parchment. If we come a little bit further forward to Hippocrates, once again, don't know exactly when the Hippocratic Oath was written, quite possibly not by Hippocrates himself. In the famous words of Mark Twain, it was another guy by the same name. Once again, there's the Greek, but Hippocrates said, neither will I administer a poison to anyone when asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a course. So when it comes to things like euthanasia, Hippocrates was giving you his thumbs down. Let's fast forward a couple of millennia, and we get to this phrase, first to do no harm, which is very familiar to all of us and is so ancient and venerable from our perspective that people think that it was in the Hippocratic Oath, but it wasn't. It's very difficult to trace the exact origin. It may well have come from a man called Thomas Sydenham, as in Sydenham's Korea, and he was known as the English Hippocrates, but he was only in the 19th century, so it's much more recent. And that phrase enshrines our medical principle, our ethical principle of non-maleficence. The idea of not harming the patient. And I know that you know what those other ethical cornerstones are. And the panelists and I were just discussing before you came into the room that perhaps it may be time to slightly move away from those four pillars of our modern medical ethics because they may perhaps no longer reflect what we need them for. Part of the problem with first do no harm is that quite often, and you know this as practicing doctors, you can have a patient in front of you where harm is going to be inevitable, right? Whatever happens to that patient, it will lead to some kind of harm. So perhaps a better way to look at that is not do no harm, but to choose or to guide the patient towards choosing the course that will lead to the least possible harm. Euthanasia makes us uncomfortable, and it's right that it should do so. Our own mortality is inevitable unless you are my uncle, who frequently reminds me that he's planning to live forever and that it's worked so far. It's very uncomfortable to confront the truth that one of these days we will cease to exist. Your viewpoint on that may be coloured by what you think may happen next. And I cannot answer that question for you. Each of you must find the answer to that in your own way. Your own religious beliefs may offer some guidance and comfort in that direction. But whether or not you think there's something that happens after you, we naturally value our own lives extremely highly. And we naturally assume that everyone else does too. Anybody with empathy or compassion would naturally feel that about other people. And we intuitively and rightly believe that killing is wrong for that reason. But I want to just take you down a little bit of a narrative. I want you to imagine a situation where there's a human being suffering from a condition that involves a dreadful prognosis where premature death is inevitable, right? So we're talking about something prolonged, undignified, grueling, and dreadful. And the reason I mention Huntington's disease in particular, right? Huntington's is a familial disease. It leads to motor ataxia, eventually dementia, and inevitable death. And it tends to happen in the onset of it is in the third or fourth decade of life, by which time many people have had children. So what that means that if you are a Huntington's disease patient, almost certainly one of your parents has gone through Huntington's disease. And you've been able to watch what happens to them day by day. And you will know that Huntington's is incurable, and you will know that that will happen to you. That's one of the reasons why I think Huntington's is an especially cruel disease. But motor neuron disease is very much the same, except that you may not know anyone who's had it. Some of the people with Huntington's, they commit suicide, or at least they attempt to. And it's very difficult for us because we're not in their shoes. And I would put it to you the question that could their decision to do that be rational or pragmatic? Can we really put ourselves in their position and say, well, I wouldn't do that if I were you? You know, medical paternalism would say, yes, doctor knows best. It's much better if you stay alive for a long period. I have sympathy with people with Huntington's and with other dreadful conditions who attempt to take their own lives. For people who do take their own lives, or people who just simply express the desire to do that, we often view the paradigm that those people are mentally ill or depressed. And our treatment is that we go up to them and say, oh, you want to die, you must be depressed, have some Prozac, everything will be fine. And that is, as I say, the normal way of us approaching those people. Sometimes when they attempt suicide, it's unsuccessful. So people may set themselves on fire, or they may deliberately crash their car at high speed, or they may do something dreadful. And our current paradigm is that those people come into hospital and we save them. So I'm reminded of a case that happened in Edinburgh where a man had attempted suicide by tying a rope, a ligature around his neck, sticking it out of the window of his car and tying it to a post at the side of his driveway. And then he was in his car, the rope's around his neck, sticking out the window, and he put his foot down and he attempted to decapitate himself. And he was unsuccessful, but he did paralyze himself. So he got to a situation where he was fully able-bodied, and then he further went on to be in a situation where he was no longer able to make further attempts on his life. That wasn't a win for that man, I have no doubt. So saving those people, are we doing them a favor? I'm not sure that we always are, even though our current paradigm is, of course, to attempt to treat them. And people who commit suicide successfully, it's often horrible. People throw themselves in front of a train, or they jump off a bridge, or they often end their lives in very violent and dramatic ways, which are very traumatic. If you're the train driver and someone jumps in front of you, that can be a career-ending experience for you. And if you are, the police or whatever, coming across the body of someone who's ended themselves, or even the relatives coming into a room and finding someone swinging because they've hung themselves, all of that is dreadful. What happens if you're unable to commit suicide? So this is a situation where you may be physically unable, like my patient in Edinburgh with the neck injury. You're physically unable to procure the means to end your life. You may ask your family to help you, and there have been cases of family members who've helped their loved ones to end themselves, and those people don't do well. They get into court and they get into all kinds of hot water. Sometimes they even go to prison. Some of those people ask their doctors for help. Can you identify this charming, smiling fellow in the picture? Anyone? Yeah, Jack Kevorkian, Dr. Death. Okay, I don't agree with him. I don't think he's a hero, but he certainly was a very high-profile individual, a doctor in the United States who was an outspoken proponent of euthanasia. And he eventually did some jail time and was let out on the condition that he wouldn't ever have any contact with people contemplating death at the end. And I wonder if behind the scenes there are some other situations where perhaps a doctor with a patient may say something like, "Now, Mrs. Jones, these sleeping tablets are extremely strong. It's very important that you only take one at a time, or who knows what might happen. Oh, by the way, there's a month's supply." I do think that circumstances like that have happened. Let's move along to the situation where we decide that someone has not got the ethical capacity, they haven't got the mental competence to be able to decide to end their life or to want to end their life, and yet from the outside they seem to be suffering terribly. Is it moral to withhold treatment in that circumstance? Quite often we do. We may withhold antibiotics, we may withhold surgery, we may even withhold feeding. And those people may then, basically die of starvation or pneumonia or unpleasant ways to die. And I would draw your attention to this quote that you may have seen, "Thou shalt not kill, but needst not strive officiously to keep alive." And that quote was from a man called Arthur Hugh Clough, who apparently was an assistant of Florence Nightingale and saw a great deal of death in the Crimea. Is it moral to euthanize such people? You may have your view on that. Let's take one step further and talk about animals. So animals are often beloved by their owners. I love my dog, and she loves me, certainly if I can judge by the amount of saliva that she puts on my trousers. When you've got a beloved pet that becomes too old or sick, we often consider they're suffering too much to endure, and we get the vets to put them down, and the vets do that quite a lot of the time. You can't seek your dog's opinion on whether it's too old or sick to carry on living. And you have the intent to do good to your animal by relieving its suffering. How does that situation differ from the person above, who's a human being who lacks that mental capacity to express a wish to end their own lives? For me, it's easy. I argue, without one shred of scientific backup, that human life is qualitatively different from animal life, and therefore it's easy to make that decision. But you may have different views. Your mileage might vary. Of course, there are plenty of counter-arguments. The religious or moral prohibitions that killing is wrong. There is the idea that we're altering the course of nature, although I think that the entire science of medicine is all about altering the course of nature. We could be playing God. We could be playing the Nazi card by saying, if we embrace euthanasia, we're no better than those Nazis. The reason I think that's different is that the Nazis were not killing people because they wanted benefit to those people. They were killing people because they believed it would benefit themselves. So what they were doing was genocide. It wasn't euthanasia. And of course, many slippery slope arguments, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. Another counter-argument is people change their minds a lot. So what happens if someone wants to end their own life and then they change their mind? What happens if someone has been pressured into it by their family members who want granny's insurance money or some other, they want her house perhaps, or some other thing? What happens if the euthanasia is unsuccessful? Can you make it worse? Well, of course. It may not be fair on those people who end up having to do it. There may be elements of guilt or burden about doing it. And you might even say that there's no need for euthanasia when palliative care is so effective, but you and I both know that effective palliative care services are not always available right across the community. So this is where we're at so far. Death we consider to be a very great harm, but we also consider prolonged suffering to be a very great harm. Where suffering cannot be reasonably alleviated, does there come a point where death becomes a lesser harm than allowing that suffering to continue? Let's talk a little bit about ethics. So if we talk about particularly euthanasia, and we talk about autonomy, first of all, a person with ethical capacity is the best judge of their own best interests. We may not be able to put ourselves in their shoes, and we may not agree with what they choose, but we already accept, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses and blood transfusion, that they will often tell you, I would rather die than receive a blood transfusion. And we go, okay, sign here. and then we just operate on them. I would say that non-maleficence, which is not doing harm, I could say that prolonged intractable suffering could be a greater harm than a comparatively swift and painless death, but only if the patient says that it is. And we can't say for them. We can't detect how much suffering they have. Beneficence, which is doing good to the patient. Doctors can provide assisted dying in a controlled and painless and dignified manner. That means the person knows when it's going to happen. So they can put their affairs in order. They can make their last preparations. They can, phone up and have those conversations with those people that they want to. They also themselves are freed from the uncertainty of when it's going to happen. And for the family, the uncertainty is gone. There is often an issue with dying relatives, and I have had relatives in this circumstance where you know they're going to die. You just don't know whether it's going to be today, tomorrow, next week, or next month. And you're always on this tenterhook, bracing yourself for that phone call. So with euthanasia, at least you've got a date that you can circle on the fridge. And the person can perform their spiritual or cultural observances if they feel the need to do those things. So in some circumstances, I would say that euthanasia could be an act of kindness. And fairness, it may free up resources, although economic arguments carry very, very little weight with me where this sort of stuff is concerned. Let's do a little bit of this stuff. Assisted dying is a kind of penumbra, under which there are two broad categories. There's physician-assisted suicide, where a doctor provides the means for a patient to commit suicide, but the patient triggers that act themselves. Either they take the tablets, or these days they've invented suicide machines, where the patient just kind of presses a button and just kind of happens. And then there is euthanasia, which is where someone other than the patient actually performs the act, the injection, or what have you, that ends their life. And euthanasia can be divided into three groups. The involuntary euthanasia, which is where the person has ethical competence and refuses death. And in that circumstance, that's murder, which is not part of my job description. There's non-voluntary euthanasia, which is where the person lacks ethical competence, but their life is ended with the intent of benefit. And I stress above that this is with the intent of doing benefit to the patient. And then voluntary, which is the person has ethical competence and requests death. So the law says that active human euthanasia around the world is legal in the Benelux countries, Colombia and Canada. Physician-assisted suicide is legal in Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, several of the states of the United States. New Jersey is just about to come on board. And the Australians will soon be able to see what happens in Victoria, where their legislation will come into effect in mid-2019. That legislation was passed into law about 18 months ago, but there's a kind of delay before it gets rolled out, and that will happen later on in this year. And you can see how thrilled everyone in Victoria is about that. Here in New Zealand, there was a little bit of a history behind some of this. So in 1995, Michael Laws had a Death with Dignity bill, which was defeated. And then in 2003, Peter Brown, his Death with Dignity bill was defeated again, although by a much narrower margin. And then in 2017, David Seymour produced an end-of-life choice bill, which passed 76 to 44. But it actually wasn't all that great a document, and it's gone in front of the Justice Select Committee, and they have done a great deal of amendment to it, and it is a much better document for that, and it's currently awaiting its second reading in Parliament. So the Justice Select Committee considered thousands of submissions, and I commend their report to you. It's very, very thorough and detailed and very balanced. And they explicitly considered the legislation and stuff that happens in other countries, all of them, individually and in detail. This up there on the screen is the submission that was sent to them by this college. So in essence, let me just boil down this document for you, and I'm sorry, I'm in my last 2 or 3 slides. There's going to be a bit of reading from the slides, which I don't like to do. So in essence, this is what this document will look like if it passes into law. So this will only apply to people who are over 18, New Zealand citizens or residents. They must have a terminal illness which is likely to end their life within 6 months, or a grievous and irremediable medical condition. They must be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. They must experience unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner that the person considers tolerable. And the person must also have the ability to understand the nature of assisted dying and the consequences for them of assisted dying. Doctors may conscientiously object, but if you do object, you must be able to put the patient in contact with someone else who doesn't object. 2 independent doctors must separately examine the patient and talk to the patient and then agree. This bill mandates the establishment of a support and consultation for end of life in New Zealand advisory group, SENS or SENS, and the doctor, of course, must not proceed if they think that the patient's being pushed into it. This bit is where the rubber meets the road. This is the methods that the patient may choose. So ingestion, triggered by the patient, could be tablets or syrup perhaps. Intravenous delivery, triggered by the patient pressing that button. Ingestion through a tube, triggered by the attending medical practitioner, or an injection triggered by the attending medical practitioner. And the rule is that the attending medical practitioner must remain in attendance until the patient has died and then certify them. There is also paperwork and registration which must go through. Doctors will be exempted from any criminal liability and participation. The cause of death will be recorded and be considered in law to be as if the assisted dying had not been provided and the patient had died of their main illness. And the final kind of thing that I'm going to put to you is nothing in this Act affects a medical practitioner's duty to alleviate suffering in accordance with standard medical practice. So we all have to look at what the media thinks about this. What I've done is I've spoken to a lot of people, I've thought about a lot of things, I've tried to find out as much as I can, and I've read a little bit about this. And what I've found overall when I look at the media is that, broadly speaking, the media is unfavourable. They're hostile about this, they're questioning about this. This very last thing came from the New Zealand Herald, where they had an article by this woman, Claire Freeman, who was rendered tetraplegic at the age of 24, initially wanted to pursue euthanasia, but has now changed her mind and now argues against euthanasia. So my second last slide. The climate seems to be changing. The mainstream media seem broadly unwelcoming to the end-of-life choice bill in New Zealand, although there are some pieces out there that offer more balance. The Medical Council of New Zealand is currently opposed, as is the British Medical Association and a few other bits and bobs. There are advocacy groups on both sides who will argue their points one way or the other. From a particularly New Zealand perspective, it will be interesting to look at Hawaii and see what happens there, because Hawaii is another Pacific island and it has great similarities with New Zealand in terms of the Western versus the Pacific island cultures. I have two final thoughts to share with you. This comes from Doctors.net, so this is an online doctors-only website in the UK. In the end, for me, it boils down to the fact that I can imagine a situation where my quality of life was so poor that I did not wish to continue it, but I could not kill myself unassisted because of my physical impairments. In that situation, I would be grateful if someone helped me. If I would want that for myself, I cannot reasonably say that no one else is allowed to have it. So that person is a doctor, but they didn't give their name. We've already got our own Baroness at this conference. We've got Susan Greenfield, but this is another Baroness. This is Honora O'Neill. And she writes in The Guardian, "In a world of idealized, wholly autonomous patients and of wholly selfless and compassionate families and professionals, legislation providing for assisted dying might, if ethically acceptable, not be risky. But we do not live in that world. And I doubt whether we can draft legislation that is safe for human beings with their full variety of situations and dependence on one another." So it really is over to you to decide what you think is right for you and for your patients. If you want to continue this discussion with me, please send me email. You can get hold of me through my website. Thank you very much for your time.